Hello, everyone. I'm Michael from the Marxist Education Project. This is, I haven't counted how many events we have had this winter and spring from this year's Socialist Register, Beyond Digital Capitalism, New Ways of Living. It has been one of I am very proud to be part of this series, and I think that Greg and unfortunately Leo can't be with us, but I've said it too many times, but some people are new here. These really are organizing manuals, and it's appropriate to be saying that because Christoph Hermann is here to speak about what we're going to do after the pandemic. And one thing we can't leave behind are these books that Greg and Leo worked so hard to do. The essays are like Christoph's that we're considering tonight, very essential to go over. I want to turn the floor over before we hear from Christoph on life after the pandemic, production for profit or production for need. I want to turn the Zoom floor over to Greg Albo, who has, as I've already said, done a great job putting this together, but I want him to have a chance to speak about Leo Panich. Greg?
Yeah, I'm not sure how much I'll say again about Leo, but maybe in terms of this volume and Christoph's essay. We had struggled. I think I did, I don't know, 17, 18 books with Leo over the last number of years, and we've kind of co-edited or written together. And I started working with him as a research assistant, as a doctoral student, going way back on his book on trade union rights and trade union freedoms and back to work legislation in Canada in the early 1980s. But one of the themes that both of us have kind of always engaged with is maybe you could say a kind of a two-pronged approach all the time. One prong being dissecting and criticizing the right and the things the way they are, and attempting to also propose alternatives on where we might go. It was something that kind of has always animated our research and writing, but also is integrated in our own personal politics. And this was kind of the theme that we constructed over these two volumes on Beyond the Market Dystopia and Beyond Digital Capitalism, New Ways of Living, was to kind of tackle those two things at the same time, and particularly to kind of give a read at the state of our politics and societies after, more than a decade since the financial crisis started turning into this long phase of I don't know, slow recovery or slow death. It depends on what eyes one looks at it with. And before the pandemic had hit, Christoph, actually, we always had discussed, Leo and I, when we could get him to write something for the Register that would take advantage of his superlative work for a long time out of Forba and in Austria, the research center linked with the OGB, the Austrian Trade Union Federation, and the work that was, in many ways, Christoph has been at the forefront of researchers on privatization issues for, I don't know, I don't want to give away your age, Christoph, or anything like that, but certainly for a decade or more, say, they go easy. And been at the forefront of the privatization efforts across Europe, by the EU, but also at the national state levels, particularly in around some of the biggest utilities that had been in the public sector, and but also that he started working on alternatives, particularly dealing with the question of commodification and decommodification, which is crucial to a Marxist theory of privatization. And I think in this, so we were really pleased finally to kind of have a topic that would really hit well with his work, and particularly the current project he has that he's wrapping up on commodification. And I think in this essay, not only is it an interesting dissection the process and struggles over commodification. It's also introduces a way about thinking of anti-privatization measures in a very socialist and socialist way, but also a socialist way that also gets that kind of not only the opposition to privatization, but also captures some of the vision that we want to have in our claims for public enterprises, for collective orientations. That is the notion of a use value society as a way of kind of getting at the difference from the way that privatization and commodification work. So I've read this essay a few times. I was the lead editor on this one. I really enjoyed it. It was an easy edit. It was one of the few essays I didn't have to etch any political disagreements with Christoph. Although sometimes we've had some of those political disagreements over a jar of ale, I guess I could say. So I'm very happy to turn this over to Christoph for some of his cutting edge research on privatization and alternatives to privatization.
Okay, thank you. So I left Austria and Vienna some 6 years ago, and I'm now living in California, teaching at UC Berkeley. But it's not surprising that Greg and I have little disagreement, because I learned a lot of Greg and of Leo because I studied at York University. So they left their impression on me. And of course, I'm also missing very much Leo, good friend, great teacher, huge intellectual. I want to start kind of where the essay begins. My initial thoughts when I was thinking about what Greg and Leo proposed that I should write about. And one thing that struck me when I started thinking about that, this was still the early phase of the COVID crisis, April, May last year. And one thing that I found interesting is that what we were confronted with, and in some parts of the country and some parts of the world still confronted with. I know situation in Toronto is not very good here. It's much better now, thanks to the vaccine. But the major challenge, it seemed to me, was how we can tackle with the pandemic, how we can tackle the disease, how the crisis you would think, at least, I think, primarily a healthcare crisis, a crisis of our health. But when we looked into the media and how the discussion quickly evolved, it seemed to be at least as much of an economic crisis and a social crisis than it was a healthcare crisis. Very quickly, the whole discussion was about, first of all, of course, the Trump administration refused to acknowledge the healthcare problem, that it is a threat and that we have to do something about it. When they finally admitted and started to adopt measures, it very quickly then became a discussion about what about the economy? We have to reopen. We can't close down, and so on. And the interesting thing that I found was that, especially here in the Bay Area, we were really early on. We had our first lockdown starting in March last year. So we were among the first, at least in the US, that went into lockdown. And the interesting thing was that we had enough to buy that we could continue to live. So we could still go to a shop and buy whatever we needed. I know there was some shortage in some goods, toilet paper, and so on. But generally, rich countries like the US have stocked up a lot of goods that allows us to continue to live certain amount of time, weeks, months, maybe even a year. So from that perspective, knowing that we would have at least to some extent the material base to reproduce ourselves, to use a Marxist term, I found it quite alienating that very quickly this question about the economy, about opening up, about the stock markets, about job losses, all these things came into play. And then I started to ask myself, why is this the case? Why can't we just, given our the level of material wealth that we have, why couldn't we just sit back and take a break for a couple of months, a year? Of course, we need essential workers that would have continued to do their job. But many parts of the economy are not essential. We don't need them to function, to survive, at least for a certain amount of period. And so that then created all kinds of more questions. At some point in the discussions, here, at least here in the US, it was presented like we have a choice between protecting human lives and protecting economic livelihoods. When the whole discussion, and we have, by the way, we have now discussions, similar discussions again in parts of Europe where economy is opening up, even though they still have a high infections rate, with the argument we can't go on like that. We can't be closed. The economy is at least as important as our health and our bodily livelihood, if I may express it like that. Then as a result of this approach that the economy is at least as important as our health and our well-being, rather than taking a break, what we had is that people had to cope with, on the one hand, working from home on Zoom, some even going into work, while at the same time caring at home for their children because the schools were closed. This created this enormous stressful situation. I myself, we were in our kid was at home for a year. So one of us would sit at home and watch him Zoom schooling while the other one was teaching. And of course, and working in the evening, in the nights, on the weekends, on all these things. And why are we doing that? Right? I'm not, at the same time here in the Bay Area, for example, another thing, during the lockdown, Tesla opened up. The Tesla, which is located a little south from here in Oakland, outside Oakland, opened up because the idiot Elon Musk insisted that the company would open up, otherwise he threatened to relocate to Texas or somewhere. Why was it so important to produce Tesla cars in the middle of a crisis? Why not taking a break? Why not selling cars for a year? What would have been the big loss if we wouldn't have produced and sold cars, automobiles for a whole year. This break that to some extent existed for a short period, at least here, by the way, had a very positive effect on the environment because this short break, even this short break, led to a decline in carbon dioxide emissions. Of course, the reason why we can't take a break is, I think, is because our economy is not primarily oriented towards satisfying our needs. It's primarily oriented towards creating and maximizing profits. And while we can take a break, profit making cannot take a break. Profit making cannot take a break because it's dependent on profit expectations. So what we have seen when the COVID crisis hit, we very quickly saw the fall in stock prices, the crash on stock markets, because of course, deteriorating profit expectations. And this then led me to think more and connect it with other issues that I was contemplating about. So the fact, I think, that our economy is profit-driven rather than needs-driven doesn't allow us to take a break, to take care of our children, to take care of our needs, and stop working during a pandemic that we just have witnessed, and some of us are still affected by. That was one of the starting points where I came up to this idea that to solve COVID crisis and future similar crises, we need to move away from a profit-driven to a needs-driven economy. A second starting point was from my, as Greg mentioned, my work on commodification. As Greg mentions, it's about a decade initially, more with privatization of public services, increasingly commodification that goes beyond public services. And I just finished a book that will be published in July. The title is The Critique of Commodification, Contours of a Post-Capitalist Societies. And in my work of understanding commodification, the pitfalls and the negative effects of commodification, I also then ended up thinking about alternatives to commodification. Mostly when we talk about alternatives to commodification, we talk about decommodification. Greg already mentioned that decommodification's limits to the extent of commodification. One example would be, of course, collective agreement, work time legislation, but public services to some extent, and other things. The problem with decommodification is decommodification can only go can only move to a certain degree, a certain extent in a capitalist economy. We can never have full decommodification. When we have full decommodification, we no longer have capitalism. So decommodification, I think, is, in a sense, a passive reaction to the problems created by commodification. It's important, very important in our societies in this age. Very important also because it gives us room to think about alternatives to commodification. But I'm in my book in particular, I make the argument that we have to go beyond the commodification to pose an alternative to commodification. In the book, I'm now mixing a little up the essay and the book, but I think because it covers a similar issue, and in particular when I'm then come to talk about the use value society. In the book, I make an argument or pledge to understand commodification, going back to Marx, as a subjugation of use value to exchange value. Marx argued or noted that all goods have use values. Goods that are used by human beings have some sort of usefulness. But commodities differ from these general goods, as commodities have both exchange and use value. Commodification, exchange use value, means, broadly speaking, a usefulness, ability to satisfy human needs. Exchange value means price, the money a certain good receives when it is exchanged on a market, usually in a capitalist economy, exchanged for money. Commodification then becomes the process where goods attain exchange value in addition to their use value. And not only that, Marx explains that very well, exchange value becomes the main purpose of production. Use value becomes kind of the byproduct that allows these goods to be sold. Somebody pays something for it. So commodification as a subjugation of use value to exchange value. Exchange value takes precedence of before use value. This distinction between use value and exchange value, I think, is still extremely useful to understand what's going on in the world, in particular, what's going on in the economy. And when I initially talked about privatization, we did a lot of studies on privatized companies in Europe, what changed when they were privatized. And usually economic theory doesn't really allow me to understand what's going on. According to economic theory, they would have improved output, become more efficient, offer better goods, better services. What really happened is that they were looking for ways to make money and started to do things that had nothing to do with their initial public service purpose and obligation. So I think, and this still allowed me to understand what went on when these corporations were privatized. Use value, exchange value, this distinction, unfortunately, disappeared in mainstream economic theory. End of the 19th century, we have the invention of marginal utility with marginalist revolution. Use value more or less disappears is nothing that is talked about outside the fringes of Marxist political economy. And even in Marxist political economy, I would argue use value played a marginal role as most Marxist economists focused on profit rate and on quantitative indicators. Again, commodification, subjugation of use value to exchange value. Both. So the first, the critique of a profit economy in the crisis. We need a needs-based economy. On the other hand, we need an alternative to commodification that goes beyond simply reducing market forces, that proposes an alternative to market private ownership and profit maximization. The next question then is that I also address in the essay and address in the book is how would a needs-based economy look like? The first thing then I observed or remembered was, or we should remember, is that a needs-based economy were common, were actually the normal situation until the arrival of capitalism. Pre-capitalist societies were needs-based economies, and still those few societies that still exist that are not capitalist, indigenous societies are usually needs-based society. So asking for a needs-based society is nothing new. In a sense, it's connecting the history before capitalism. But I'm not proposing to go back to a pre-capitalist economic system. The problem with pre-capitalist needs-based economies were that they were subsistence economy, largely agricultural subsistence economy with a surplus extracted by the ruling elites, the political elites in the respective countries. Europe, most commonly feudalism, of course. This as subsistence economies, these systems contained a limited division of labor. Family, what we today would call based on family farming, a low degree of mechanization, and as a result, a low productivity growth. They were, in other words, largely stagnant economies. Right? There are some people on the left, ecofeminists, some ecological Marxists that actually propose that given the destruction caused both by capitalism and by state-run communism in Russia and Eastern Europe, that we should go back to some form of subsistence economy. Bielefeld School of Economics, Bielefeld Feminist School of Economics would be one example where scholars are actually proposing that. I'm not convinced, to say the least. I have to say I personally enjoy the amenities that comes with having a modern economy based on a detailed division of labor, machinery, automation, and so on. And I think many, perhaps most people, wouldn't be attracted by a socialist alternative that wants to turn them into small-scale farmers, right? So what we are looking for is a needs-based economy that goes beyond a subsistence economy, that does more than a subsistence economy. I don't think a subsistence economy is an attractive alternative to capitalism. In other words, I think what we need is an alternative that focuses on needs, but at the same time is dynamic and improving, not necessarily growing in the sense of material growth, but improving our living conditions. The goal is not to justify needs. The goal is not just to satisfy needs. The goal is to satisfy them in a continuously improved manner. Family farming, as I mentioned, is not the answer. I think we need an alternative needs-based economy that takes full advantage of the potential of human cooperation and the full deployment of human capacities that go beyond farming. And these capacities, by the way, that are often neglected and marginalized in a capitalist economy, where a lot of work is of course alienated, reduced, simplified, and so on. So the alternative, a needs-based economy that improves, that is dynamic, that responds to needs, responds also to changing needs. In the essay, in the book, I call this alternative a use value society. Use value society, because, and now I'm coming back to my definition of commodification, my definition derived from Marx. What we need as alternative to commodification is an economy that strives for maximization of use value rather than exchange value, which means maximization of satisfying needs rather than profit. Right? So here I make then the link between my critique of commodification, my take on the limits of decommodification to an alternative that goes beyond decommodification, that is trying to promote, to increase, to improve use value rather than exchange value. And also, of course, this would constitute the needs-based economy as a response to the problems that we have seen in the COVID crisis. The next question then is, how can we maximize use value? Or even one step back, how do we know that use value is the use value that we are creating is better, greater is probably a problematic term, is our improved use value. Again, going back to Marx, when Marx talks about exchange value and use value, he says exchange value can be assessed quantitatively, measured, most commonly measured in money terms. The nature of use values is precisely that it cannot be measured. It is, use values are constituted qualitatively. They as quality, their nature is precisely that they cannot be measured in quantitative terms. Right? An interesting, and on a side note, what what we see, those of us who are teaching at universities know that attempts by university administration to measure the quality of our teaching and the quality of our academic output are kind of, I think, failed attempts to square the circle. They are asking students in students' evaluation, and the students' evaluations are then taken as if they could reflect the quality of our teaching. As we know, and there are lots of studies, they measure all kinds of things, but not the quality of teaching. The same way, this general impact factor assessments that are out there, where I don't think at York University, but and not even here, I'm not sure here at Berkeley, but in many universities, your standing as an academic is measured. The quality of your research is measured in your ability to publish in this so-called high impact factor journals. Again, complete failed approach to judge the quality of academic research. It cannot be quantified. That's the simple effect. Peer review is an attempt to deal with the fact that it cannot be measured. University administrators don't like peer review because it still gives too much power to faculty. In the book, by the way, I call this form of commodification fictitious commodification. But I think what we see here, for my argumentation, important here is the inability to quantify quality. It's a simple fact, and there is no way around it. So what do we do with use value? How do we assess use value? What can we do? And here, I think what comes in and the link to Robin Hanel's essay, we cannot measure usefulness, but we can discuss usefulness. We can, as a group of people, society, wherever we wanna draw the line or the border, we can sit down and discuss which solution, which product we think is more useful than the other. In other words, we can't assess use value quantitatively, but we can assess it qualitatively through discussions, deliberations, and in the end, democratic decision-making processes. So here, I now make the connection between alternative use value orientation and the need for the democratization of the economy, democratization in the sense of some form of democratic planning. I'm not an expert in democratic planning, and Robin Hanel has a great essay in the Register, and I think he's about to published a new book. He and Michael Albert published a lot. Sam Gindin had a very interesting essay out a couple of years ago. I think it's an essential element of a use value society, but I leave it to other people to figure out the details, how the best way to organize this democratic plan. What I think, what is missing from my perspective in some of the debates, for my taste, they're a little too much focused on adjusting supply and demand, and there is, I think, not enough attention paid to the question. What, from my perspective, would be interesting: how to institutionalize a process of use value improvement. how could we do that in companies and on a broader level. Use value improvement is a result of this idea that we don't want to have a subsistence economy, that we need a dynamic, changing, improving economy. In the essay, I then also kind of take up the question of efficiency, because usually the main argument against democratic planning in the literature, apart from Hayek, who thinks that it's not possible because of information, lack of information, and so on. But what is mostly usually brought into play is the argument, it's good and nice, but it's inefficient. And there is some point to that. Of course, all of us, or most of us, have spent too many hours in useless discussion. I think we need to take that seriously. But on the other hand, what I think is important when we talk about efficiency in connection with use value society, I think we need also to question this concept of efficiency. Efficiency means measures input in relation to output. The idea, less input, more output, more efficient.
Not making a choice is not a choice. It's,
okay. Efficiency, increasing output, minimizing input. What I think, this is a highly problematic concept. I give a couple of examples in the essay. One example here is just fast food. Fast food, highly efficient, but the food is very unhealthy, lack of nutrition, and makes people even sick. So what do we make out of that? Hospitals, people nowadays, we did research on not privatization, but marketization in hospitals. Some hospitals are pressured, administrator pressure staff to get people out from the hospital as quickly as possible. A significant part then has to come back because they were released early. In the numbers, they look as if they increased efficiency a great deal. What I think is what we need, and what I when I talk about a use value society, is to move away from output to outcome. So what counts is not the output. What counts is the outcome. Outcome can be achieved by other things than just simply producing more goods, more products, as it would done in the traditional account of efficiency. And we think of outcome instead of output. I think we can also make an argument that when we take time to talk and think about the best solution in terms of outcome, it may very well pay off to take time, discuss, and think. So efficiency, away from this traditional account of efficiency that focuses on inputs and outputs, to an account that focuses on outcomes. Related with outcomes, I also think, and here I bring in Karl Polanyi, who in an essay distinguishes between collective and individual utility. We could also call that collective and individual use value. Utility was the translation, the first that translated the essay into English, used the term utility. Polanyi himself doesn't use it. But what Polanyi does is that he says what might look useful from an individual perspective, from the perspective of the individual, might be quite harmful from the perspective of the collective or the perspective of society as such. One example that I also use in the essay is our SUV, sports utility vehicles, which have increased, sales have increased in the US for some time, increasingly also now in Europe. These vehicles are larger, heavier than regular cars, and as a result, they produce more carbon dioxide. Made, by the way, the increase in SUV sales made up for progress made in terms of fuel efficiency and electric cars. So from an individual perspective, it may be useful to drive an SUV. From a collective social perspective, it's harmful to drive an SUV. Interestingly, I also think in here, of course, the specific Californian thing comes in. It's even harmful to drive an electric SUVs. What we now have here in the Bay Area is more and more people driving around with large electric SUVs. Large electric SUVs need greater batteries, which cause a greater ecological cost, but also they are more harmful when they hit pedestrians, people on bikes, and people in regular cars. So, and then we have, by the way, we have this crazy dynamic that people buy SUVs to protect, that's what I'm hearing when I talk to other parents. They buy SUVs to protect their children because they are concerned concerned about car accidents. We have this crazy dynamic that it makes sense for to buy an SUV to protect your child, while at the same time you are the threat to other participants, to other people on the road. So, and when we take this critique of Polanyi, we need collective decision-making processes. We need democratic decision processes to decide what are preferable utilities and collective or social utilities that we are aiming for. In the case of SUVs, it would perhaps be public transport, the better, more sustainable solution to the need of transport that people have. Okay, so that's where I make the link between maximizing use value and democratic planning, democratic decision making in economic processes. One thing where I think I would depart from Robin Hanel and Michael Albert is that I think from a use value perspective, not everything has to be organized in democratic planning. I think from a use value perspective, we can accept certain markets that do not infringe on the use value of the product. Put it differently, markets where producers still have a main interest in their product, in their service, their primary interest in the quality of their products and services, rather than in maximizing profits. And one example is farmers markets. I don't think that we need to do away with farmers markets and have some democratic decision-making processes in local agriculture. I think for such things we can still use markets as long as if the competition and profits interests do not harm usefulness or use value. That, of course, then it can also be your local coffee shop. If it's a local coffee shop, we don't have to socialize that and turn it into a democratically run operation. Maybe a good thing, maybe not. But from a use value perspective, I think there can be room for local markets. Again, which I think is different from Robin Hanel's and Michael Albert's account. Democratic decision-making process, important element, crucial element in alternative that I call or want to call use value society. Two more elements I think that are important, but I will be brief on these two since I'm already speaking almost for an hour. One is, I think, is sustainability. In sustainability, instead of unlimited exploitation of nature, I think sustainability is not an unproblematic term because it was used by mainstream ecologists to justify, still justify growth, but making it less energy consuming, more energy efficient. So we have to be a little careful to use the term sustainability. I think it's still useful, in particular when it is linked to sufficiency. Sufficiency here, I'm thinking about particular the work of the idea that our needs are limited, and what we should produce should only kind of satisfy our need. So sustainability important because it also sets limits to democratic decision-making process. We can have democratic decision-making processes, but not democratic decision-making in process at the cost of future generations. Because these future generations, of course, they don't sit at the table and discuss with us. So here, I think there is a limit for democratic decision-making processes. On the other hand, we need democratic decision-making processes to kind of arrive at a system that is sustainable, especially when we link it with sufficiency. The discussion, what is enough, has to be a democratic one. Right? What is enough in a sense of I don't need an SUV. I don't need a car that can go, I don't know, 150 miles per hour. I don't need, here in California, we have all these people who have homes with 20 rooms, 3 homes, and they don't live there. What do they need it for? So we need a discussion about what is enough, and this discussion has to be result in some sort of democratic decision-making process. The third element I think is important is solidarity. Solidarity instead of competition. Again, I think when we take it seriously, a democratic decision-making process that tries to find the best collective solutions to satisfy our needs. We need solidarity in the sense that this means that we may have to put back our immediate individual interests for larger collective achievements. So here, solidarity not only in the sense of mutual support, but also from a Marxist interpretation of giving precedence to collective needs over individual needs. Here, of course, in a big issue that has been raised by others is climate solidarity. And this whole discussion how we solve the climate problem. Here in California, the solution, of course, is everyone buys an electric car and puts solar panels on its house. This will not solve the climate crisis. We can't go on like with our lives as if nothing happened. Solidarity also, I think, important because even if we have democratic decision-making processes, we need to respect the interests of a minority, even if we have majority decision-making process. So I think these are the three elements in my idea, and of course this needs more elaboration and more thinking, but I think three central elements: democratic decision-making process, democratization, democratic planning, sustainability, solidarity. In the next question, I would briefly talk about what's the difference, if there is a difference, between my idea of a use value society and socialism. Right? Why not call it socialism? I think the way I understand it, I understand use value society as a transition towards socialism. And I think the advantage of using the use value concept is use value society concept is that we can see already alternatives in the existing capitalism that we are living in. There are many forms around us where people intentionally or unintentionally promote use value. Non-profit organization, a number of them, cooperatives, small family farms, communal gardening projects, neighborhood art, buy nothing initiatives, and other things. So we don't have to wait for the revolution. We can start changing things in small steps right away. I think an important fight that needs to be fought is about the nature of public services. I think public services, and here I'm linking back to my earlier research on privatization, is public services should be the prime example of how we can promote use value instead of exchange value, rebuilding public services so that they meet the needs of people rather than the needs of investors and others. To following or kind of linking to what Greg will talk about when he talks, will talk about post-capitalism in his essay in the Register. A lot of these accounts of post-capitalism are based on the idea that we have technological progress. Technological progress will bring or opens at least the possibility of moving beyond capitalism. Here, I think use value society, it's important for me that it does not depend on technological things. Use value society starts rather than with tech workers often is usually tech workers are presented as new elite that moves beyond capitalism. Use value society starts not with tech workers. It starts wherever people care more about their product and their clients than about money, including many nurses and doctors that for more than a year now have treated COVID patients. Right? So here, I think that's where we should link up and from where we should use and move on. And I think from that perspective, I hope at least this concept of use value society makes sense and is useful. Okay, I think that's from my side. Questions?
Thank you, Christoph. Thank you. So I have put in the chat to write the word stack if you have a question or comment. Christoph, thank you very much. Your talk, when you were talking about Elon Musk insisting on this factory and the choices people make in this exchange society, in the marketplace, the paragraph you began about American investors being worried about the superhero dolls being made and such, and that with this trade with China would come to an end, is just lets us know how much of what all of us go to work doing each day has no relationship whatsoever to what we need. And when I was reading the essay, there are parts of it that you could, if you were rewriting, you would bring up to date with what we have gone through in the 14 months of this long pandemic. We know that this is going to continue for some extra time. Is this not a time where, even though we can't get together, but is this not a time where we as left people should be bringing these questions forth? But how do we do it? I mean, so many people are satisfied, even if they're on the left, that we stopped Trump here in the US. Others are satisfied if they recycle a lot and buy their food locally and such. But how do we get from our everyday lives of our left activism, et cetera, that we've been doing, and make it somehow different? I know that's not you can't really answer that. We as a people need to figure this out. But how do we change the language to get to moments towards this transitional period? And your essay is very good, and I think Greg will address this. And the other talk the same day on community restaurants. When Mal Milano was here, he was talking about a working class cinema that is needs-based. A really interesting approach, rather than what we are now witnessing with a cinematic expression. It's all stuff to push more superheroes our way. The entire cinematic universe that had all these spectrums of experience from whatever, even if they were not progressive, there has been such so many expressions have been reduced to what the marketplace needs. I've talked enough. I'm giving the floor back to you. There's also a comment from Brian Evans. We should take Brian's comment as well, so that you can address both things. Go ahead, Brian.
Thank you, Michael. Hello, Christoph. Good to see you after, I don't know, 3-4 years. Hope you're doing well. We should catch up later. But I wanted to pick up on a couple of things, kind of a comment, but maybe a bit of a poke out to you, which is around democratic planning, and a comment you made around outcomes, or what I call in my work in public admin, public policy, performance measurement. And democratic planning, I think, is essential. Democratic planning linked to thinking about and reconceptualizing the politics of public services, not just the things that people need, but that is the point. They are what people need. They become that nexus where they are ultimately, maybe not everything, but the big ones, like in terms of, I'm in Canada, healthcare, public education. These are highly political areas of public service delivery. And because they are fundamentally about what people need, I think they provide a kind of terrain which is politically important to the broadly defined left. And that's something which I think we on the left, other than people like you and Greg and a few others, don't really deal with the whole issue of public services, but how they come to be manufactured, how they come to be delivered, which comes to your point about democratic planning, which I think is essential in work that Greg and Leo did well over a decade ago. I can't remember, 23 years ago, around democratic administration. Around democratic planning is about bringing many voices to the table in its simplest way. But that means that, I'm talking as a former government person before I became an academic, pushing, maybe not moving out, but pushing the voices of the ruling class to the margin. Or if not the margin, then they have to share a table for deliberation. Because, I think in a lot of the liberal literature around democratic deliberation, it is liberal, where it doesn't account for differences in power. And democratic deliberation in a liberal context is a table on top of highly uneven power relations, power structures. And anyway, that's my comment, but I know you well enough to know that you have a lot of ideas percolating through. So if you want to address any of that, feel free. But thank you, and good to see you again.
Yeah, let me address that first. I think in one of the things that we found in our research way back, when we went into these companies and talked to workers, work council members, and even managers. And before they started this transformation process, let's call it privatization, also not all of them were then ended up being fully privately owned. But what they told us was, in the past, the system was ran on a hierarchical structure, classical bureaucratic organization, top down. Then the business administration people came in, and they kind of changed that to the needs of the market, which actually means finding ways to increase revenues and cut costs. That's what they did. But when we now talk about rebuilding public services, I think we agree, it's important not just to go back before the neoliberal onslaught. The situation before the neoliberal onslaught was not satisfying. For the people who were working. Working for the post office was not necessarily great before privatization of the post office. Nobody asked the workers what they thought, what could be done, could be improved, could be changed, should have been done. So I think, and I guess we are on the agreement. One thing about this performance measurement craziness, when all of us who teach, for example, I think students should have a say in running the university. Students should be part of the decision-making process in universities. Just letting them fill out an evaluation doesn't mean they have anything to say, right? And for example, what I thought would be interesting, I don't have the resources, but rather than have this stupid student evaluation, why don't have group discussions after a class, after a lecture at the end of the semester, and let a group of 5 randomly selected students discuss why this class was useful or not. it would be really interesting to see the outcome. And I think we need measures to make things responsive. The university that doesn't do that because that would cost money, and for whatever reason they don't want to do that. But I think it's not just to ignore that or go back. We have to find ways to improve responsiveness, to create some kind of accountability in an overall more democratic fashion. The other question, where do we go from now? And that's a really tough one. And I don't know. I unfortunately don't have a good answer on that. But it's one thing just in my personal environment. All those people who have young kids in the crisis will tell you how awful it was, how stressful it was, that they have to continue with their job as if nothing happened, while at the same time watching and taking care of their kids, including the university. What the hell? Why didn't we shut down the university? Or why we rather than forcing the students to take exams in these times? I had the students emailing me, he lost his dad. And under these conditions, we expect him to submit an exam. Why just give them a year off and have classes for fun for a change? I mean, I know we want to offer them something. We don't want them to be isolated. But why not just have a year or a semester where they can read whatever they like, have discussions without pressure of this stupid exam system? Our students, they are tired, they are exhausted, they are depressed. I mean, why? So that they don't lose a year of working in their working career. I mean, think about it. What changed it that would have made if we just would have taken a year or a semester teaching and studying for fun. So I mean, in terms of strategy, but I think that at least a number of people that I know, they experience the COVID crisis as quite a challenge, exhausting. And I know I have one friend that works in the university administration at the University of Vienna. We are not doing anything that is essential. Come on, we are not I mean, if you in the medicine part, yes. Social sciences.
Greg, you can go, and then Michael Dola has put a question up in the chat for everyone, but you could do Greg, and then everyone can read the chat, but I don't know if they are.
Let me just quickly respond to that social labor. An interesting thing is when I haven't talked about labor, and here one thing that I think interesting is that when we talk about a use value society, it also, from my perspective, implies kind of appreciating jobs based on the use value that they are contributing. And if you would do that, it would turn around labor markets. Suddenly, what we in the crisis have called essential worker, we find that they produce essential use values, whereas people who will make a lot of money do things that we can do without, including stockbrokers at Wall Street. Promoting use value in connection with work and labor would also mean doing away with dequalification and de-skilling that we see in so many parts of the economy. So I also think that there is an important and very useful link to start thinking about the value of labor in terms of use value rather than exchange value. Another point that I haven't really touched in my presentation, but I think it is, I do it in the essay and even more so in the book, is the connection between the value of nature and use value. I think it's important, or it's useful to understand the value of nature as use value. And here I know there are some people who contest that and argue that nature has value independently of human needs. I think, from my perspective, I think it's useful to make that link and understand nature as something that provides use values. And sustainability means maintaining these use values, allowing the reproduction of these use values. And this, by the way, then also something I still have to think about more, I think allows to combine with what's often I feel this connection between worker struggles, labor struggles, and environmental struggles. Often they are put together, both claimed and nature and workers are exploited. I think when we, and that's something I'm at least going to try, is to build the link between the two on the connection of both cases. It should be about use value when it comes to nature as well as labor.
Okay, Jurassica and then Carol would both have questions. Go ahead, Jurassica.
Hey, I really enjoyed your lecture. I'm so glad that I came to it. I'm in a Capital reading group with Mary Boger right now, and I can't tell you how necessary and useful it was to hear you referencing things in Marx that are in Capital that have been so abstract and have been really difficult to like wrap my mind around. And I feel like you articulated in this way that made so much sense and seemed like very realistic and interesting solutions to these, ginormous problems that we have in a way that feels accessible, but still very true to Marx, and almost like made me feel just like, yeah, it's valid. Like this is still the work of this education project, and the work of Marx is, I think I don't have to spend too much time saying we all appreciate that. But I appreciate you sort of bringing that all together for me. My question is, I wonder, I think that I value the idea of a use value society. And I also think that like thinking about the collective versus the individual needs is important, especially democratically. But I wonder like how you, without being sort of like judgmental or like how you make space for people, especially young people who have been sold consumerism and who have been sold capitalism and who have been sold having 20 pairs of shoes and looking really cool and having, have been sold our popular American culture that says that that really gives a lot of social capital to looks and to clothing and to just even the idea of like being wealthy. I just wonder, like, for me, those things are things that as a young person, I can acknowledge, I can see the way that they influence me. And then I can also like take a step back and realize that I don't need those things to feel good. But I think that a lot of young people, even if they want a very progressive future and a socialist future, or a future where like even just like basic needs of people are being met. I sometimes just like struggle with like, how do I talk to my friends and conceptualize an eco-socialist sort of future that I don't know, like yeah, that like acknowledges that maybe this isn't going to go away. Like maybe that it's maybe we don't all, you know, believe in consumerism, and maybe if we continue to increase the use value society, those things will start to fade away. But like, how do we talk about those things and articulate those things when popular culture is telling young people that like plastic surgery and fashion and making enough money so that you can kind of just like afford a basic existence, all of those three things are like really influential to people right now. I know that's like kind of a lot, but I can't articulate that in a way that's more simple. So thank you.
That's very, it's a great comment and a difficult thing, no question. Two things come to my mind. The first one is when I was still studying in Toronto, by the way, one time I flew home. They got me a seat in business class because they needed my seat in economy class to sit the family together. If you sit in business class and you compare it with economy class, you have more room. But then it comes to the meal. In business class, you receive a tray full of industrialized food. In business class, there is, if you're lucky, there's somebody who cooks for you. You get a slender, fresh meal. That's what money buys. The stuff most kids are buying is industrialized, produced. It's not garbage, but it's low quality. What I want is everybody gets a meal, a business class meal. And I think that's what we should tell young people. I have problems. I don't know if any of you have heard about probably the degrowth movement. This idea that we live behind our means in the global, which has something to it. But I don't think it's very attractive to tell people, oh, you have lived behind your means and you have to scale back. No, I don't want to kind of scale back. I want to improve. Improve means quality, not quantity. I think that's the angle where we can convince some of the young people. One thing here, in one example, I think that it partly goes back to David Harvey's work about housing. Housing, the use value of housing as a place where you can live with your friends and your family, or as exchange value as an investment opportunity. Now here in the Bay Area, we're in a situation, and I think Toronto is not that much better, where housing has become this investment, this huge investment thing, with the effect that young people can't afford to buy a house here in the Bay Area. They stay with their parents if they are from the Bay Area. And if they can buy a house, you buy a house for $1 million and it's still a crappy house. I think, I mean, at least when I talk to my students, that's one of the things that they are concerned with, that at some point they are planning, even if classical American way of living, they want to be able to buy their house at some point. It's no longer possible, or to a large extent, no longer possible if a housing sector that is based on exchange value rather than use value. at least I hope these are some angles to start them to talk and rethink stuff. By the way, one thing, and probably you know more about that than I do. What I find fascinating is young people buy all kinds of different stuff, but then they buy at the same time the 5 Apple products that all look like the same. We could say use value of society is Apple products for all. And thank you for your comment on my interpretation of Marx. I just want to say I'm probably gonna be attacked by what in German we call Marxologists because of my free interpretation of Marx. So there will be enough people out there that will accuse me for misreading Marx.
Carol, you are on stack, so go ahead.
Okay. I really appreciated Jurassica's articulate comment and question. It's really a conundrum that so on one hand, we're talking about use values. We all, use values are great, clothing that lasts a long time, food that's nourishing, homes that are comfortable and warm. And I'm just wondering if taking a cultural approach to consumerism is maybe the wrong way to go. If there was democratic planning for basic human needs, then things like education, housing, food, healthcare, if the basic jobs could be addressed, then I wonder if a certain amount of the consumerism, sort of for its own sake, would fall to the wayside. When I was a young starving student, I couldn't wait to get a job and start getting some basic goods, some decent clothing, shoes that would last, a house. And until you achieve those things, they're very desirable because they're useful. And if you can't buy a house and you're renting, you're going to do other things to make yourself comfortable. So I'm just wondering if emphasizing use values, we need to be, looking at. This also ties in a little bit there with the nonprofit. Nonprofits in a capitalist society it depends on the nonprofit, it depends on the field, but they can be very exploitive. And someone else, I've worked in them before where someone else was making the money. Would it be better to just focus on this democratic planning process to make sure that people have the basics of what they need, and then hope that or encourage the consumerism to kind of diminish in importance?
I would hope so, yes. But I mean, we should also acknowledge that part of youth culture is the negation of consumerism. Capitalist culture is great in absorbing these things. I grew up with punk rock, squatted houses, and that was the cool thing to do. So we always have pockets of anti-consumerism, I would even call it anti-exchange value attitudes, but they are not dominant or hegemonic. At some point, I think we will have to explain to young people as to other members of society, is driving an SUV, if I can take this example. So young people are probably not interested in driving an SUV, but driving a car that is harmful to the environment and harmful to other people on the road is a problem. So part of the education, of course, has to be to kind of promote these ideas of solidarity and of collectivity after decades of this neoliberal individualism. And I think now, for example, the one thing that the COVID crisis has clearly shown, and at least some of my students get that, is individually we are lost if we can't respond as a collective, right? The other thing, I think when I talk to my students, a huge problem for them is now student debt. We're not talking about consuming. They are coming out of college with debt on their burden. So consuming is not the very first thing on their mind nowadays. The very first thing is get a job, make money to pay back student debt. I think in Canada, it's not as terrible as it is here in the US. And for example, then one way to deal with that would be free public education. Free public education, but not only free public education at a good level. So that we, for example, here at Berkeley can make a UC Berkeley education free, which isn't a huge thing. It was the case until the 1970s. So we are not talking about a world-changing radical idea, but my students would be all in favor of it. They would be all in favor of it. I just saw Brian's comment on Red Vienna. I'm not sure if I use it, at least in the book, where I use Red Vienna as an example, where it's not only about providing a roof over the heads of worker families. Wasn't the case in the 1920s and 30s at the heyday of Red Vienna. It was public service in that sense of providing a better alternative to the private sector. That's why I think Polanyi was also so enthusiastic about Red Vienna.
Christoph, there are long comments, but Greg was on stack. Greg, do you still have a question?
Sure. Maybe. Sure. Liked your essay and your presentation, and I don't think I've read your book. I read some chapters of it. I remember that, and not the whole thing. So I'm looking forward to getting a copy. But I also think what you're accomplishing is quite important in the sense of what we need to extend ideas about a transitional economy and kind of the concepts that we need to further, which I think are it's not a critique of the older ones, but it's to speak about the present period that we're in and to relate to kind of the need to displace neoliberalism in the time period. It strikes me some of what you're doing is, although he writes in a very different vein than you in form of presentation, is close to Livelihoods in a sense of alternative way to think about the struggle over the production of needs in capitalism. And it strikes me that one of the things one of the things you do is elaborate the notion of socially useful production in a different way by your call for use value society. But what I find in Livelihoods that kind of is on the periphery of your presentation is the question of workers' plans and the agency of workers and how much that would have to be integrated into your call for use value strategy. I think the way that some of the ways that we have to think of deepening this is connecting to some of the ideas you have with and how to reanimate conversion strategies from destructive sectors, and connect it with that question of conversion. And where is the agency we find from confusion? Partly is our ability to reestablish community demands, which saying if you've invested here and the community support is provided X, Y, Z supports of whatever, you don't simply have the right to withdraw your claims over ownership. We have a community claim over that asset or whatever. and begin that kind of covers everything from certain ways storefronts, and to kind of bigger issues of factories, et cetera. But I think, one of the ways to deepen what you're saying is to link it to workers' control, but particularly kind of the capacity, the way to need to spark workers' controls. Of course, workers have to kind of also to begin reforming some conception of what they would do differently. So I think kind of what you're putting forward of seeing it as part of a struggle for, and linking it to conversion for a struggle for an alternative has very concrete things there. One of the things that I also think I was left wondering about is a lot of what you come to end to tends to be skirting where there's spaces right now, because you didn't so much focus on the areas of anti-privatization. But it strikes me one of the needs that we have, one of the requirements we have is to also think through what are some of the alternative state practices and concrete concepts around measurement, around participation, around regulatory structures, like in the kind of things that even when we add participatory structures, even council structures, what are some of the socialist forms of administration that would go alongside that? There was experiments, as you mentioned, Red Vienna. That would be one way to partly probably retrieve ideas of alternative forms of administration from measurement and on, and certainly kind of the initial period of the Russian Revolution also was throwing out kind of different kinds of ideas. There's a real need to give democratic administration or participatory administration, whatever, democratization content in these practical forms too. And the struggle that you're doing with this Youth Value Society seems to me to connect with that notion as well. The final thing I would say that you didn't come back to, but I've been just wondering if you have some stories to tell or examples. I thought initially that the crisis over COVID would throw up a lot more demands for use value struggles, a lot more demands for control over the healthcare system from communities and from the people in the healthcare sector. But so far, we've seen very examples where we have kind of all kinds of memos and alternatives from doctors to the blue collar workers in the hospitals for what they want to do differently, what they would like to see, but orientation to kind of demands where they're actually taking things over, or not so much taking, but rebellions that are occurring around workplaces that's kind of pushing that, which seems to me there's lots of spaces in those of us who are embedded in public healthcare systems where it's already in the state sector and the demands for communities, et cetera, to kind of push this. But I've not seen anything pop up, that the mutual aid efforts were, so small and weak and scattered and really don't deal with things in a way that's structured enough that kind of could pose an alternative for provisioning, say, for getting food to the poor, offering alternative sheltering provisions for homeless. Just the homeless were doing it on their own in the typical way the homeless have, but not because, and mutual aid just failed to touch them directly enough. And the state became so preoccupied with most other things, it didn't fill in that space either. The desperate measures to take over some empty motels here and there, was, on the margins, was mainly a preventative measure, not of spread, rather than alternative measure of a housing provision. So I was wondering if you kind of had picked up any kind of counter examples that would have that would carry your vision that occurred during COVID.
I think, yeah, let me start with the healthcare. I think in the United States here, healthcare discussions, in my impression at least, are very much focused on expanding public healthcare, in the sense moving to a Canadian system. That's basically, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's what my impression is. All those on the left are presumed with discussing the need for expanding healthcare coverage, which the crisis has shown once more that it's very important. Little talk about what an alternative healthcare system would look like. What's interesting, though, I think, is obviously what the COVID crisis has shown is the importance of public health as an issue, and the neglect of public health as an issue for probably decades in this country, probably longer. In other countries, also to a relative limited extent. Public health officials or the researchers, they study statistics, but you rarely hear from them that they would propose a really different approach and system to healthcare, including, of course, prevention. The lack, non-existence of preventive care in these countries. And preventive care, of course, is hugely important in a needs-based approach, but unimportant in a profit-based approach. You don't make money from avoiding diseases, right? You can clearly show the fundamental different approach, including workplace, health and safety issue, prevention issues, completely out of the picture. And I mean, I don't see it that COVID is bringing it back or bringing it more into the focus. But if we would see COVID, it seems to me that it's clear that to deal with a lot of health issues, you have to make sure or try these people not become ill in the first place, as we do with COVID, right? So public preventive care, workplace, the whole opiate crisis in the United States, this craziness, and by the way, also during the COVID pandemic, that people dealing with stress, dealing with exhaustion. I mean, there are limits in what doctors can do, but even in normal times in the United States, they prescribe antidepressants. In the US, more than in any other country, and I don't have the authors of the study. I read about the study that most of antidepressants are prescribed by doctors without any psychological consultation. So this whole issue, I think, I don't see the initiatives, unfortunately, but you would think that COVID brings that into the focus. I'm also, I have to say, I'm not 100% sure what our public health, at Berkeley we have public health people, what their research is really about, and what the questions are that they are following. Seems to me that the little it's basically statistical work that they are doing. But I think it's, of course, there will be a huge need in that direction. I'm more hopeful in that it's taken up in Canada than it's taken up in the United States, though. The other thing, I haven't thought really about issues of conversion, but going a little back to the role and workers' involvement. But what seems to me, and what I know from many interviews I did a lot of research on work-related issue, IT work, other work when I was still in Austria. But most workers have what I would call a use value orientation. They are interested primarily in the product or the service that they are delivering. If it's not a de-skilled, highly supervised work situation. So generally, workers are interested in use values and use value orientation. It's more alien to them when managers come and tell them, oh, they have to stop here. That's all they can spend on the development of this product. And even the workers feel it's not as good as it should be. They throw it out on the market or deliver it to the customer, even if it's probably because management decides they can't spend more time and resources to make it better. That's when workers often feel alienated. Even highly skilled workers feel alienated in their jobs. I would even go as far as to say it's precisely because workers resist exchange value orientation that capitalism works. It's because they don't think like capitalists, and they refuse to think like capitalists. Is that we are able to, or the economy is producing decent and functional products. So I think, and ideally we could also kind of link to that, and I think most it's kind of the almost the default situation that people are interested in the usefulness of what they are doing and the usefulness of their product. It's alien, strange when management comes in and says, you know what, but what counts is our profit.
Christoph, when you speak of all the production for exchange and all the detritus it leaves everywhere, it seems that part of our transition to the youth society is repurposing these SUVs, these towers in the sky that are of no purpose, the redevelopment of things. And in a way, what you are talking about is to develop movements and discussion so that we get a broader sense of the difference between how we engage our lives. And one thing that I notice, even I'm very sketchily employed because I work in printing and very little printing takes place. So I'm called like every 2 days of each month. But the people that are working there more are enjoying their time off. They all look healthier, happier, even though their incomes are less. They're finding they're not spending though they don't make that much, they're not spending as much money because the stress is less. And many other aspects of life have improved despite the pandemic outside the door and everything else. So we're near the end of our 2-hour time. You have made a very thought-provoking essay and extremely important discussion for us to consider. I hope you can come on Sunday for Benjamin Selwyn's talk on community restaurants that is just along the line, and Greg's Post-Capitalist. I'll send you the link. It would be great. I'm not putting pressure, but it would be great for you to be part of that discussion.
I just have to negotiate with my partner. One of us has to watch our kid. That's
of course. It's one of those things that we all have to contend with. And thank you very much. The other day, Pratyush Chandra was here from India. Instead of thumbs up, he said we need to celebrate our being together. So thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was really a pleasure. And thank you for the great questions.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Ciao, ciao. Ciao, ciao,
Bye,
ciao, ciao.
everybody.
See you, Herman. See you, Christoph. Ciao, ciao.